Right, yes, so the topic of my talk today is the academic nomads and campus vagrants. Now, nomads are people who have many homes. They're a community that has to move with its possessions from place to live. The term academic nomad is usually used to describe people who move between universities in the course of their academic life. Now, one day, while watching architecture students laden like camels with models, rolls of drawings and laptops on their way between car and studio, it occurred to me that it can also be used to describe people who have to move with their stuff from place to perform their academic tasks. Vagrants are people who have no home. So a home is a place where one is safe, comfortable and cared for, the place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or a household. Considering the belief that architecture students live in the studio, why then the consistent complaints by teachers in architecture schools that students spend so little time in their studios? As a student, a teacher and a moderator, I visited many South African architecture schools and have often noticed that there is a disjuncture between what schools expect from students and the facilities which they provide. In designing for designers, lessons learned from schools of architecture, Jacques Nassar comments that when people buy a product, they expect it to look good and work well. Architecture must support the needs of its occupants. And yet, that architecture students often have to learn the principles of good design in some of its worst examples. Could it be that we unintentionally turn our students into homeless people on their own campus? I say this because it appears that perversely, architects have turned the poor quality of school environments almost into a badge of honor. In 1923, Rex Martinson described the dusty, leaky, hot first building of the Wits School as having the atmosphere of something new to be discovered, and that the minor physical disabilities did not kill their enthusiasm for the intricacies of an exciting art. This, of course, is not only a South African phenomenon. Consider an article in the New York Times Architecture Review that says, more than any other American building, the home of Paul Rudolph's severely brutalist Yale School of Architecture holds a special numinous place in the hearts of architects throughout the world. Yet that the suspicious fire in 1969 is what may have been the single most incendiary act in the history of architectural criticism. The same commentator hopes that the extensively remodeled building will be far more amenable to human habitation than it has ever been before. Let's look at some other examples. The Bauhaus, the iconic curtain wall system, before a 6.3 million euro thermal upgrade, was drafty, leaky, the interior too hot in summer, too cold in winter, and the glare often unbearable in the studios behind that curtain wall. Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology, of which a teacher commented that Miss might not have valued privacy, but our students do. At the Harvard Graduate School of Design, one of its students says in his blog that with tourists clicking away from the overhead galleries all the time, it's like living in a reality show. Note the cover that one of the students built for himself to get a little bit more of privacy and comfort. The University of Sydney Wilkinson building. Well, at least of that building, its students said that the library is very good, and the building also appears to be undergoing an upgrade from this image on their website. I'm not claiming, of course, that all schools are unpleasant places for learning. In lessons learned from schools of architecture, Nassar et al. Studied 24 schools across the globe using post-occupancy evaluation. And some of them, for example, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, what a lovely name, Turkuaz Eylül in Izmir in Turkey, and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences were generally very positively assessed by the architecture students. Now, apart from the concerns about studio use, Another complaint that's often heard in the staff rooms of schools of architecture is that empirical architectural research is difficult, and that particularly that there are few methodologies that suits the needs of architectural research. So I will now propose to you a way in which both of these problems can be addressed. As part of my master's research in 2011, I tested my hypothesis about why students vote with their feet when it comes to studio use. That studio conditions in South African schools of architecture do not support spending long periods of effective work. I asked full-time third or fourth year architecture students at 4 very diverse South African campuses. That's the University of Johannesburg, Wits, the University of the Free State, and the Tshwane University of Technology, about 85 students in total, about their needs for the studio environment and their opinions of their studios. Before I share the results, I must just briefly explain the research process. Because my interest is in how people experience the built environment and how their experiences can be improved through better design, the underlying approach was positivist and phenomenological, so I wouldn't struggle over that one. Now, phenomenology explores the things and events of daily experiences and emphasizes subjective meanings and intuitive meanings and descriptions of the world. And just in case I get accused of a touchy-feely design approach, let me describe positivism. Now, positivist research is concerned with gaining objective knowledge through scientific methods of inquiry. The emphasis is on measurement of scientific quantities such as time or temperature, or of attitudes, behaviors, and opinions. Methods of measurement include surveys, analysis, and statistical procedures. Conclusions are then drawn to prove or disprove the initial hypotheses. I used, as Dionys referred to previously, post-occupancy evaluation as a research methodology, and combined this with the importance performance analysis to report the outcome. Now, this may all sound very complicated, and believe me, it is hard to say sometimes, but it's actually quite logical and straightforward. Post-occupancy evaluation is one of several forms of building performance evaluation. It is defined by the Royal Institute of British Architects Research Steering Group as a systematic study of buildings in use to provide architects with information about the performance of their designs and building owners and users with guidelines to achieve the best out of what they already have. This approach asks the occupants of buildings already in use about their opinions of its qualities, and is obviously useful for building owners and developers to find out if there are any problems with the building once it's in use. It is based on the evaluation of functional features rather than the aesthetics, the technical or economical features alone, and therefore often used in the property management field to obtain a snapshot of customer satisfaction at any specific moment. Unfortunately, and despite the fact that it's formed part of the RIBA Plan of Work since 1965, architectural researchers and practitioners seldom make use of POE for testing the success in use of new buildings, of prototypes, and for developing guidelines for future designers. The problem with POE is that while it helps researchers to collect valuable data, it does not have a built-in way of making sense of the research findings. Simply asking about how spaces perform does not provide one with enough insight into the minds of the respondents, into their specific needs and wants. In my research for a research instrument that would help me do this, I came across importance performance analysis. Now let me explain that a bit further. As a service provider, for example, universities provide clients with a range of services, from the first contact point, often the website, through the registration and administrative processes, and of course by providing suitable physical facilities for students to learn. I will refer to these as service attributes. Now, by plotting the performance of the service provider in selected attributes against how important those service attributes are to students, I IPA is a clever method of identifying which of the services are, if we start from the top right-hand side, the ones that are both important and well provided should be obviously maintained at their current level, or even heavily promoted, because they provide a strategic advantage for the service provider. Services that are well provided but unimportant can often be given less priority. It's a bit of overkill in that field, that area. Services which are poorly provided but not important in any case can be ignored or can provide a nice-to-have benefit if judiciously improved. The important one to look at is where services are important to the client but poorly provided by the service provider. These require immediate improvement and also strategic and immediate resource allocation. This, of course, this whole process makes the research process a little bit more complicated because the matrix plots the performance of these variables on the x-axis and the importance on the y-axis of the scattergram format. It's necessary to ask in the survey not only how well a specific attribute performs, which is usually the case, people are just asked how good is the service, but also how important that variable is to the respondent. But this is very much worthwhile to a phenomenologist because developing such a matrix helps an organization to evaluate the importance of services from the client's perspective, that's client expectations, to assess the performance of those services, so how satisfied are clients with the service, and then also to decide how these services should be managed, in other words, internal strategization. Now, amongst the 37 variables in total that I did test in my research project, I included feelings of safety, experience of summer and winter temperatures, the need for quiet space and outside workspace, adequacy of natural and artificial lighting levels, and the availability of pinning boards, which is always a problem in architecture schools. I also asked students how many hours, in addition to the minimum required by the timetable, they spent in the studio or elsewhere working on campus. To illustrate the strategic value of this research instrument, let's take maybe a silly example. Both ceilings and computers are important in schools of architecture, but which one has more strategic value? If a school has 200,000 rand to spend, should they install new ceilings or upgrade the computer lab? Now, this may be a bit of a no-brainer, but what about more pinning boards versus better Wi-Fi? That's maybe not such an easy decision, and so a bit of research needs to be done. Let's look at some of the results of the research on an IPA matrix, and I must point out that I'm showing you the combined results here of the 4 different schools. Almost every time I discuss the results, I get the response of, yeah, okay, but how did we do? Everybody wants to know how their school did. And that is, of course, very interesting. But there's not enough time today to do a comparative analysis. And there is a chapter in data analysis and the statistical results in my dissertation, which should be available online through the WITS library. The table of attributes, I don't know if you can read that, that I'm going to show you the results of, is outdoor workspaces, views to the outside, small group spaces, big group spaces, individual workspaces, personal safety, and computer labs. Now, in general, schools understand that computer labs are important, so they're high on the importance, the y-axis, and they also provide satisfactory service according to the users. So computer labs, way high up in the high performance, high importance quadrant. The same goes for small group spaces, big group spaces, and views to the outside. Generally reasonably well provided, and they are important to students, the clients. The problematic services that came up was personal safety, and then two somewhat surprising results, quiet workspaces for individual study and access to workspaces outside of the building. Now, personal safety was in fact reasonably okay at 3 of the universities, but a huge problem at 1 specific of the universities, which pushed it over on average into that quadrant. Now, before I discuss quiet spaces and outside rooms in more detail, let's just look at the hours spent in the studio. Now, on here, the grey bar, the one on the right-hand side, shows the average for each block of time. I looked at weekdays, so the first block, the first column or set of bars is for time spent during class time or whatever in the studios. The second one is evenings between 5 and 7, at night between 7 and 10, then over the weekend, and on the right-hand side is the total time spent in the studio per week, which is, if we claim that students live in the studio, well then between 12 and 17 hours, maybe not. So in this case I do show a breakdown per school because of the difference in hours spent, particularly at the green school, so the fourth of the bars in each set, where extremely long hours are spent over weekends compared to during weekdays. And I had an interesting discussion with one of the teachers from that school last night, so there you see the proof. I will limit my fuller discussion of the selected attributes to the 2 variables which have consistently shown up as an opportunity for strategic response by schools. That these were identified as universally poorly provided for, I love that image, was more or less expected, but that they also turned out to be those which were most wanted by my fellow campus users was a bit unexpected. Now, creativity, as Duggan remarks, requires solitude as well as collaboration. I personally need a quiet space with few distractions to work, and an iPod can only help so much when the second years crank up the volume in the studio. So, a comment that silent scholarship is often impeded by the cacophony of collaboration immediately made sense for me. It's been proven that the busy, noisy atmosphere that goes with communal student spaces does not suit all learning needs or personality types. While many contemporary learning theories are based on the need for exposure to social interaction, studio problems are often the result of the misconception that learning requires constant social exposure. And this is far from the truth, and excessive exposure can cause psychological stress in those who prefer silent scholarship. Not surprisingly, considering my need for peace and quiet to concentrate, I've always found that working outside just works better for me. Lau and Yang helped me to understand this by introducing me to the concept of healing gardens. How even a short time in a small garden space can bring a sense of being away. How the positive psychological and physiological effects of natural settings can soothe away the stresses of student life. It seems that neither the designers of buildings nor of landscapes consider outside spaces as rooms, even though environmental behaviorists have understood this relationship for a long time. As we know, a happy and healthy individual can become more productive due to better ability to focus on the task at hand, as told to us by Kasim and Zakaria. It was therefore inevitable that I also ask questions around access to green spaces or even just views to the outside. So when we need a little bit of this, or even this, or even just this ergonomic nightmare, what we get is this. By not researching the needs of their clients in a valid scientific way, I believe that designers and administrators of schools of architecture underperform in providing those facilities that are important to students, yet we expect them to spend many hours working in the studios. So spare the complaints that students spend too little time in desert-like studios when they're really just being nomads, moving on to an oasis where their needs are better met. By not providing a home, we are turning our students into campus vagrants, people who are reviled for choosing an alternative to unbearable conditions at home. The very consistent responses by architecture students from 4 universities on the state of their studios and their needs of those spaces should be a strong indication to those administrators and designers as to where they should focus their attention to make an academic home for their students. Thank you.